How ready are we to tackle this extreme change? What are the things that we really need to be mindful of to be equitable?
Thanks, Aram, and thanks, Class Act. Happy to be here, actually, particularly with this question. And I'm sitting here in New York, and in a few hours, we're expecting a torrential downpour that potentially will last for the next couple of days. Yet another in the series that we've seen. And it's a very good question around getting ready, or if we're ready. And I think, from my perspective, I don't think we are ready. I think we're in the process and at the beginning stages of even having a conversation about what ready means. And I want to just sort of focus us on what I think, and others could argue with me on this, but three sort of concepts around what getting ready is going to mean, particularly for urbanized communities and societies around the world. Some of this will resonate mostly in a Western context. Some of it may already resonate in other contexts, but the first is sort of cultural. The second is behavioral, and the third is infrastructural. And by cultural, I mean, what we need to understand is that given what's taken place and what has accelerated, we're in a new reality where we have to embrace living with water in a very different way than we have, particularly in the sort of the era of engineering over the past 80 years. It's going to be very different. We have to embrace living with water. We have to understand that what is happening to us is not going to stop. And we have to sort of culturally appreciate water in a different way than we have in the past 80 years, particularly in cities, urbanized cities around the world, where our goal has been to transform even seeing water into pushing it aside, not understanding where it is, building over it for centuries. And in a way, what is happening in many places is the exhumation of water into the urban environment in a way that I think was not predicted by most people, because we've gone through these series of pushing it away. That has a lot to do with past floods in history and the technological advances that we've made that really are not going to stand the test of time, and we're starting to show it now. The second that builds on from cultural is behavioral. So once we understand our relationship with water has to change, we must change our own behavior. And that behavior means, as I was linking to before, we can no longer just drain it away. And we have to start transforming our policies and regulations so that that change sticks. And so when you look to examples around the world, or even here in the United States, in the Pacific Northwest, in places in Europe, particularly the Netherlands, after 1952, in France over the past decade with several floods across France, but particularly for those who watch television or are very active in media, the very close calls to flooding in Paris. All of these things have to change. And what we're starting to see is changing in behavior, changes of behavior that result in changes in policy and regulation other places, including here in the US, but that has to also accelerate. And then the third is infrastructural. So once you have sort of the cultural fabric of society understanding the place that water has in our society, the behavior starts to change around our policies and regulations and the way we develop. The third is infrastructural, which is to transform the way that we have been building for this quote unquote threat for the past 50, 60, 70, 80 years, and transforming it into something different that we're living with and we see it as a resource and a value, and also understanding how we can live with it to mitigate a lot of the suffering that we've seen over time. Thinking about nature-based solutions, integrated infrastructure solutions, and reimagine and pull back the layers, particularly in the urban fabric that has blocked the water away from the cities. That's extremely important. There are examples of this across the world. Of course, the Netherlands, where we see a lot of these examples. In Paris, there's a project called the Oasis Project that has started to retrofit schoolyards to retain water and become park space. in a bid to try to pull back some of the fabric in Paris. Paris is extraordinarily dense. There isn't a lot of places for water to go, but using these examples to try to understand what we can do is very important in that sort of infrastructural change and thinking about how we act. Within each of these are costs and questions of who should bear those costs, to get to your second point, Aram. And these are actually the types of questions that will be taking place. We'll hear more about it over the coming weeks at COP26, and was a lot of part of the conversation in Paris before. The rich have historically always been able to adapt. There are examples time and time again of building and rebuilding. That is not something that I think we should be necessarily concerned about, because there are many people who have the resources to do so. And frankly, people have chosen to live in risky environments over millennia, in an understanding that things might happen and they might have to rebuild and dedicate resources to that. The problem is the poor and even middle class have less resources to do so. And particularly with the middle class, property ownership in threatened communities that have been very much so because our culture and behavior and infrastructure have been allowed to be built over the past 60, 70, 80 years in this country, in particular, and other cities around the world. Those investments are threatened, which could wipe out swaths of middle class wealth, as well as the suffering that we see a lot of by poor people who really have no choice whatsoever. I mean, we've seen this very recently with Hurricane Ida, with vast swaths of suburban New Jersey flooded, communities without flood insurance because they never thought they had to, and total wipeouts of middle class housing stock, and the component of wealth creation that is and has been for some time the backbone of the middle class of this country and other Western countries, and other countries that are developing, who are looking at the American model of real estate and ownership. The poor are working poor here in New York City. We saw just weeks ago in Hurricane Ida, living in basement apartments because that's what was affordable, died in flooding that happened, flash flooding that happened, because that was the cheapest place that they could find to live. Substandard apartments that shouldn't have been, frankly, the development shouldn't have taken place there anyway in the beginning. And you see this around the world. So the question is, that I don't think we can resolve, Aram, and is a part of what I think about all the time, is who pays for this? Who pays for the ability to adapt? Who got us into this mess? And who's going to get us out of this mess? What is the responsibility of government? Government extended resources to build most of these risky communities, either through the infrastructure or through mortgages or both. And so one of the big issues that we will have to deal with in the coming years, and as part of the conversation now, particularly with the National Flood Insurance Program, is whose responsibility it is. It's good for the government to say you shouldn't be building here anymore, but frankly, the government exacerbated the issues by financing the development of most of these communities, and in places with poor communities here in New York City or Houston or many other places where public housing was cited specifically in riskier locations because it was cheaper land. There is a certain level of responsibility that government has to have as a part of this. So that's a much longer conversation. And I know there are other questions later, but I think it's questions that we all have to really think about and resolve. Is we did not get this far without some sort of assistance and support. And how do we, particularly those who are most threatened and most vulnerable, how do they begin to see the light out of this situation as well? Because they do not have the resources that others have to just pick up and move.